In the 1970s, America felt like the land of freedom not just in spirit, but in everyday life. You could light a campfire at the park, ride your bike without a helmet, and let your kids roam until the streetlights came on. No one thought twice. No one called it reckless. It was simply the way things were. But looking back now, some of those freedoms could land you in serious trouble today. It was a time when rules felt smaller and the spaces between people felt closer. Neighbors didn't just know your name, they knew your story. The man who ran the corner store might let you pay for your groceries next week if you were short on cash. The local cop might stop to toss a football with kids in an empty lot instead of moving them along. Trust was a kind of currency, and most people carried plenty of it. The air of the era was unhurried. On summer nights, families gathered on front porches, sipping lemonade or iced tea while the sound of cicadas rolled through the dark. Kids played tag in the streets long after sunset, darting between parked cars and backyard fences. Parents didn't feel the need to watch every move. There was an understanding that the neighborhood itself would keep an eye out. That sense of collective responsibility made it possible for children to explore a wide world without adults hovering nearby. Laws existed, of course, but they felt less present in daily life. There were fewer warning signs, fewer restrictions, and almost no paperwork for simple pleasures. Want to fish at the local lake? You just grabbed your rod and went. Thinking about starting a backyard project? No need for a permit. Just gather your tools and get to work. People relied on their own judgment, and there was a shared belief that most folks could handle themselves without constant oversight. Even the idea of safety was different. Without the constant hum of lawsuits and liability concerns, playgrounds had tall metal slides that baked in the sun and jungle gyms with hard dirt underneath. It wasn't that people didn't care about safety. It was that they accepted a few scrapes and bruises as part of living. Mistakes were seen as lessons, not legal cases. This combination of trust, freedom, and personal responsibility created a rhythm of life that's almost unrecognizable today. It was a time when decisions were made by people, not policies, and the boundaries of your world were set more by common sense than by law. But as the years went by, fears grew, news stories became sharper, and lawmakers began to write a new kind of America, one where each passing year added a few more lines to the rulebook. But as laws tightened and attitudes shifted, the world of the 1970s started to vanish one freedom at a time. Seatbelts were optional. Kids sat in the front seat or even on someone's lap. No one thought it was dangerous. Today, you'd be pulled over in minutes. In the 1970s, the car was less a regulated space and more an extension of your living room. Families piled in without counting seatbelts, and few gave any thought to crash statistics. The idea of being fined for how you sat in a vehicle would have sounded almost absurd. It wasn't just the front seats that were free of restriction. Riding in the bed of a pickup truck was a rite of passage for kids and teenagers. On warm evenings, you might see a group of friends standing against the cab, hair whipping in the wind, on their way to the local drive-in or ball game. Dogs rode back there too, tongues out, tails wagging. It was fun, it was normal, and in many states, it was completely legal. Booster seats for children were virtually unheard of. Smaller kids might sit on a folded blanket to see out the window or stand up to watch the road ahead. Parents didn't see it as unsafe, just another way kids got to be part of the ride. The general attitude was that life involved a certain amount of risk, and not every risk needed a rule. Motorcycles carried the same air of freedom. In some states, helmet laws were minimal or non-existent, and the open road meant just that open. Riders felt the wind in their faces without the weight of heavy protective gear. Leather jackets were more about style than safety. Many saw it as the purest way to experience the road, even if it came with obvious dangers. Law enforcement, too, reflected the times. Officers were far less concerned with enforcing seatbelt use or passenger restrictions. They focused on reckless driving, DUIs, or serious accidents, not whether a child was buckled in the back. Road safety campaigns existed, but they didn't carry the urgency or legal force we see today. Over time, the cultural shift towards safety was slow but steady. Studies and accident reports piled up, and public attitudes began to change. Car manufacturers added more seatbelts, padded dashboards, and crumple zones. States started to pass laws, first recommending and then requiring restraints for drivers, passengers, and eventually even pets. Today, the freedoms once taken for granted on the road are tightly regulated, with steep fines for breaking the rules. Still, for those who grew up in the 1970s, the memory of a summer night in the back of a pickup, chasing fireflies while the highway lights blurred past, carries a warmth no law can erase. And cars weren't the only place where life was freer. Everyday public spaces had far fewer rules too. In the park, you could set up a bonfire, camp overnight, or swim in the lake with no lifeguard on duty. No forms, no fees, no permits. Public spaces in the 1970s felt open in every sense of the word. There were rules, of course, but they were few and rarely enforced unless someone was truly causing trouble. A park was simply a place to enjoy, not a list of regulations posted on a metal sign. Many parks stayed open late, sometimes all night. On warm summer evenings, families would spread blankets under the stars, talking and laughing until the crickets took over the night. Teenagers might pitch a tent on the edge of a field, not as part of an official campground, but just because it seemed like the perfect spot. Nobody was worried about a park ranger waking them up to ask for a reservation slip. Bonfires were part of the culture, especially in small towns and rural areas. Friends would gather around a roaring fire in a clearing or by the water, roasting hot dogs, telling stories, and playing guitars. No one filled out a permit application or checked an online fire danger rating. If you had wood and matches, you had a fire. It was an unspoken agreement that people would be careful, and for the most part, they were. Swimming, too, carried an air of freedom. Lakes, rivers, and quarries were open to anyone who could find their way there. Lifeguards were rare outside of public pools, and the idea of posted no swimming signs in natural water seemed unnecessary. Kids learned to swim from parents, older siblings, or simply by trial and error. Even activities that today require paperwork or licenses were far more relaxed. Fishing often meant grabbing a rod and heading to the water without worrying about whether you'd renewed your permit. In some places, hunting season was enforced more by tradition than by official patrols, and it was understood that the land itself was part of the community's shared life. Safety, in those days, came less from regulations and more from the people themselves. If someone got hurt, help came from nearby friends or neighbors, rather than an official response team. Communities took pride in looking out for each other, and the freedom to enjoy public spaces without constant oversight was seen as part of what made America feel like home. These open, unstructured spaces gave people room to breathe, to gather, and to make memories without the constant presence of rules. And while those freedoms carried risks, they also built a sense of personal responsibility that is harder to find in today's carefully managed parks. But the greatest sense of freedom in the 1970s often came from how kids spent their days. You could send your kids outside in the morning and not see them until dinner. No GPS trackers, no check-ins, just trust. In the 1970s, childhood was lived in motion on bikes, in fields, and through every alley and sidewalk of the neighborhood. The boundaries of a child's world weren't set by fences or apps, but by how far they could get before the streetlights flickered on. Walking to school alone was nothing unusual. Even young kids could make the trip with a friend or two, backpacks bouncing, crossing busy streets with nothing more than a quick glance both ways. There were no debates about whether it was safe or responsible. It was simply part of growing up. Bikes were a child's passport to freedom. Without helmets or fluorescent safety gear, kids pedaled across town to visit friends, stop at the corner store for candy, or explore parts of the neighborhood they'd never seen before. Parents didn't expect phone calls or hourly updates. They trusted that kids would make it home when they were supposed to. Even hitchhiking was a part of the culture. Teenagers and sometimes even younger kids would stick out a thumb on the edge of town, hoping for a ride to the lake or the next town over. It was seen as adventurous, not reckless, and drivers often stopped without hesitation. Many people still recall the kindness of strangers who picked them up and got them where they needed to go. Play spaces were wherever imagination led. Vacant lots, half-finished houses, and open fields became forts, racetracks, or battlefields in elaborate games. Kids climbed trees, balanced on fences, and explored creeks without anyone worrying about legal liability. The idea of trespassing rarely crossed their minds, and most adults didn't mind a group of kids using empty land as a playground. Parental fear existed, but it was quieter. Parents worried about broken arms, scraped knees, and maybe the occasional stranger. But these concerns didn't overshadow a child's independence. The unspoken belief was that kids learned resilience and common sense by being trusted to manage themselves. It wasn't until the 1980s, after a handful of high-profile crime cases made national headlines, that the cultural shift began. News coverage grew more intense, parents became more cautious, and laws began to favor close supervision over freedom. What had once been normal slowly became rare, and eventually, in many places, illegal. That era of trust shaped more than just childhood. It also influenced how Americans approached other parts of life. In fact, the same relaxed attitude extended all the way to how adults handled alcohol and driving. And that sense of trust extended beyond childhood. It even shaped how we handled alcohol and driving. In some states, you could drink a beer in the passenger seat, or even while driving, and it was completely legal. The sight of someone with an open bottle behind the wheel didn't always raise eyebrows. In the 1970s, alcohol was woven into the fabric of daily life in ways that now seem almost unthinkable. The legal drinking age told part of the story. In many states, it was just 18, and in some places, beer and wine could be purchased even younger. Crossing a state line could change the rules entirely, and young people often knew which towns had the most relaxed laws. Bars and taverns welcomed patrons barely out of high school, and no one thought it strange to see teenagers ordering drinks in public. Open container laws were far looser than today. A six-pack might sit on the floor of the passenger seat, with one or two already open by the time the trip began. Passengers sipped beer on long drives, and tailgating both at games and in parking lots often included drinking well before and after the event, with no rush to hide the evidence. Alcohol flowed freely at public gatherings. County fairs, parades, and even some school-related fundraisers sold beer without hesitation. Adults walked the midway with cups in hand, chatting with friends while their kids rode the Ferris wheel. The separation between family events and alcohol-centered activities was far less pronounced than it is today. In rural areas, public intoxication was often treated casually, especially if it didn't cause trouble. A man leaving a local bar, unsteady on his feet, might simply be walked home by a friend rather than ticketed or arrested. It was understood that everyone knew everyone, and a night of heavy drinking wasn't necessarily seen as a public safety concern unless it crossed a certain line. Over time, statistics and tragedies began to shift attitudes. Rising DUI incidents and high-profile accidents pushed lawmakers to tighten restrictions. The legal drinking age moved to 21 nationwide. Open container laws spread across the country, and drunk driving campaigns became some of the most visible public safety messages of the late 20th century. By the 1990s, the casual mixing of alcohol and everyday activities that defined much of the 1970s had largely disappeared from public life. For those who lived through it, the memory of buying a beer at a high school football game or sipping wine on a Sunday drive now feels almost surreal. It was a world where alcohol was simply part of the scenery, and its risks were often overlooked in favor of tradition and familiarity. But it wasn't just alcohol. There were other freedoms we barely thought about that would be unthinkable now. A teenager could walk into a hardware store, buy a rifle, and head home on a bicycle with no questions asked. In the 1970s, firearms in many parts of the United States were treated less as dangerous weapons and more as everyday tools. For hunting families, a rifle was as common as a fishing pole, and buying one didn't require stacks of paperwork or a background check. If you had the money, you could walk out the door with it the same day. It wasn't too unusual for kids sometimes as young as 12 or 13 to handle firearms without adult supervision. They might take a .22 out to a field for target practice or spend an afternoon hunting small game. Parents trusted them to be careful, and in many rural communities, gun safety was taught at home rather than in formal classes. The sight of a teenager carrying a rifle down a dirt road didn't trigger alarm. It was part of the landscape. Fireworks were equally accessible and just as woven into the culture. Stands popped up before the 4th of July, selling firecrackers, bottle rockets, and Roman candles to anyone with a few dollars. Neighborhood streets lit up with bursts of color all summer long, and it wasn't unusual for kids to light fuses themselves. Adults might offer a word of caution, but few saw it as something requiring strict rules or permits. For the more adventurous or reckless, homemade explosives were a kind of backyard science experiment. Mixing chemicals from household products, stuffing powder into makeshift casings, and lighting the results was considered harmless fun as long as no one got hurt. These activities carried obvious risks, but in an era before 24-hour news cycles and instant social media outrage, the dangers rarely made headlines unless something went seriously wrong. The decline of this culture began slowly. Safety campaigns emphasized the risks of fireworks and unsecured guns. Tragic accidents drew national attention, leading to tighter restrictions and eventually new laws. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, background checks became standard for firearm purchases, and age limits for both guns and fireworks were more strictly enforced. Permits replaced casual transactions, and storage laws dictated where and how firearms could be kept. Today, the contrast is stark. Gun ownership remains a deeply debated issue in America, with safety concerns at the center of national discussions. Fireworks are banned or heavily regulated in many areas, and the idea of a teenager making explosives in their backyard would trigger swift legal action. For those who remember the 1970s, the memory is a blend of nostalgia and unease, a time when freedom carried both joy and danger, and trust in personal responsibility often outweighed formal regulation. Even the way we handled money in the 1970s would shock people today. No one carried ID unless they were driving, and no one cared. You could pay cash for almost anything, no questions asked. In the 1970s, the world of money moved without the endless checkpoints and verification systems we take for granted today. If you had the bills in your pocket, that was all you needed to make a deal. ID checks were rare for everyday purchases. You could walk into a liquor store, gas station, or small-town motel and hand over cash without signing anything or proving who you were. In many cases, the person on the other side of the counter already knew you, and if they didn't, a friendly exchange was usually enough to close the sale. Cash was the standard not just for small buys, but for major transactions. People paid for used cars in envelopes stuffed with bills. Rent was often handed over at the kitchen table in crisp 20s. Even larger deals, like buying land or equipment, could happen with nothing more than a handshake and a stack of currency. There was no electronic trail, no receipt unless you wanted one, and no automated system flagging suspicious activity. Travel was equally casual. Before 9/11s, boarding a plane in the United States required little more than showing up with a ticket often purchased with cash. No ID required. Airport security was minimal. You could meet someone at the gate without going through metal detectors, and the idea of strict baggage checks was almost unheard of. In bus and train stations, you could hop aboard without proving your identity at all. This low-friction system extended to nearly every corner of commerce. Buying a used firearm from a neighbor, renting a storage unit, or making a big purchase at a swap meet all happened without paperwork. Fraud protections were minimal, but so were the hoops you had to jump through. The balance of trust and risk tilted heavily toward personal responsibility. By the 1980s and 1990s, however, the shift toward traceable transactions began. Credit cards became more common. Electronic banking expanded, and government regulations increased to combat fraud and money laundering. ID checks became routine. In the post-9/11s world, air travel was transformed, with TIS as screening, strict ID requirements, and layers of surveillance. Today, the notion of walking into an airport, paying cash for a ticket, and boarding without showing ID feels almost like fiction. The freedom of the 1970s economy has been replaced with a digital paper trail that follows nearly every transaction. For those who lived through it, the memory of a time when a deal could be sealed with a handshake and nothing more still carries a certain charm, even if it came with its own set of risks. And some of the most casual, everyday habits of the 70s would now get you fined or worse. Smoking at the diner, lighting up on a plane, ashtrays in every waiting room, no one even blinked. In the 1970s, cigarettes were everywhere, and no one thought twice about it. The blue haze of smoke in restaurants, office buildings, and even hospital waiting rooms was simply part of the atmosphere. If you didn't smoke, you just learned to live with it. Restaurants had smoking sections, but the invisible line between them and non-smoking areas did little to contain the smell. Office meetings were held across desks, cluttered with ashtrays, and flight attendants on airplanes handed out complimentary packs along with coffee. Even doctors' lounges often carried the scent of tobacco. The link between smoking and serious health risks was becoming known, but cultural habits lagged far behind the science. Environmental rules were just as relaxed. Burning trash in your backyard barrel was normal in many towns. Leaves, paper, and even household garbage went up in smoke without concern about air quality or carbon emissions. In rural areas, dumping an old appliance in a ravine or tossing used motor oil onto the back lot wasn't met with outrage. It was simply how things were done. Dogs roamed neighborhoods without leashes, wandering from yard to yard. A friendly retriever might show up on your porch for a snack before heading home, and no one worries about fines or animal control. In many places, it was expected that dogs would have the freedom to explore, and fences were the exception, not the rule. Zoning laws in rural America were minimal, and people made use of their property however they saw fit. That might mean a yard full of parked cars, a homemade shed patched together with tin and plywood, or a small business run out of a garage. So long as it didn't cause real harm, neighbors generally minded their own business. The gradual shift toward stricter rules began in the 1980s and accelerated in the decades that followed. Smoking bans moved from airplanes to restaurants to nearly every public building. Environmental regulations made backyard burning illegal in many areas. Leash laws became standard and zoning enforcement tightened. Public spaces became cleaner, healthier, and safer, but also more regulated, with less room for the rough edges of personal choice. Still, There's a certain charm in remembering a world where people lit up a cigarette without scanning for a no-smoking sign, where your dog could trot beside you down Main Street without a leash, and where property lines felt more like guidelines than legal boundaries. It was messy, imperfect, and sometimes unsafe, but it was also a world where personal freedom was part of everyday life. But even with all these changes, the memories and lessons of that era still matter today. The 1970s in the U.S. were imperfect, but they gave us a sense of freedom we may never feel again. It was a decade where life unfolded at its own pace, where the world felt big and open, yet familiar and safe. People lived with fewer rules and more trust, carrying an unspoken belief that most folks knew how to handle themselves without constant oversight. Those freedoms came with risks. There were accidents, mistakes, and moments that by today's standards would have been preventable. But alongside those risks came something we've lost in many ways: the confidence that people could make their own choices and accept the consequences. Freedom wasn't just a word. It was a daily reality, stitched into everything from how we drove to how we raised our kids. Nostalgia for that time doesn't ignore the dangers. Instead, it recognizes the trade-offs. We gained safety, convenience, and order, but we surrendered a certain raw, unfiltered way of living. Looking back, the 1970s remind us that community trust once stood in for regulation, and the lines between permitted and forbiddens were drawn far wider. These memories aren't just sentimental, they're cultural landmarks. They show us a version of America that was more personal, more neighborly, and more reliant on individual responsibility. It was an era when a handshake could seal a deal, when kids found their own way home, and when public spaces were there for the taking, not just for those who filled out the right forms. Remembering that time also means remembering the balance that made it work. Freedom was not the absence of responsibility. It was tied to it. You looked out for your kids, your neighbors, and even strangers, not because the law told you to, but because it was understood. That mutual care gave people a space to live more openly without fear that every small risk needed a government rule to control it. Today, when every action feels monitored, recorded, and regulated, it's worth asking what we've gained and what we've quietly let go. The 1970s may never return exactly as they were, but the spirit of that era, the belief in trust, personal choice, and shared community can still guide how we live now. Because in the end, freedom isn't just about what you're allowed to do. It's about the feeling of knowing you can, and that the people around you will give you the space to live your life. That was the gift of the 1970s. Which of these would you bring back if you could? Share in the comments.